Drive through any newly built apartment complex in America after dark. Not the lobby, not the gym. Walk the parking lot. Count the lit windows. Count the dark ones. In buildings that were completed inside the last 3 years, buildings where every unit was leased before the paint dried, where wait lists stretched 6 months, you will find floors that are almost entirely unlit. Not because the tenants are asleep, not because it's late. It's 8 p.m. on a Tuesday, and an entire floor of a brand new luxury building in Austin, Texas, is dark. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern, and it is spreading to every major metro in the United States. Here is what the headlines are not telling you. America built more apartments in 2023 than at any point since 1987. Rents in dozens of cities fell for the first time in a decade. And yet, somehow, housing in America has never felt more hollow, more vacant, more off. Something is wrong with the math. And when you trace it back to its source, what you find is not a housing shortage. What you find is something far stranger. Between 2021 and 2024, developers broke ground on over 1.7 million new apartment units across the United States. That is a number large enough to theoretically house every person in Philadelphia. Twice. Cities like Austin, Phoenix, Nashville, Raleigh, and Charlotte saw construction cranes become permanent fixtures on their skylines. Permits were pulled. Foundations were poured. Glossy brochures promised rooftop terraces, co-working spaces, and community-first living. Leasing offices opened with champagne. But here is the number nobody put on a brochure. In 2024, the national apartment vacancy rate quietly climbed back above 7% for the first time since 2012, even as rents in major cities were listed at rates that represent 35 to 40% of median household income. In plain language, there are empty apartments, and there are people who cannot afford to rent them. That is not a supply problem. That is a structural problem. And the structure was built deliberately. Austin, Texas. Austin added more new apartment units per capita between 2021 and 2024 than virtually any other American city. The result looked, briefly, like a housing success story. Rents fell. Landlords competed. A one-bedroom that had listed for $2,100 in 2022 dropped to $1,550 by late 2023. Then, something changed. The incentives shifted. Large institutional property management companies, entities that control tens of thousands of units across multiple metro areas, began coordinating pricing through shared software platforms. Several are now under federal antitrust scrutiny for alleged algorithmic price fixing. The software in question aggregates occupancy and pricing data across thousands of properties and recommends rent increases, or holds, based on what competitors in the same zip code are charging. The result, even in a city with a glut of empty units, rents stopped falling. Landlords found it more profitable to hold a 10% vacancy rate than to drop prices and fill the floor. Those are the dark windows. Phoenix built aggressively. It also attracted a different class of buyer, the short-term rental investor. By 2023, entire complexes in the Scottsdale and Tempe corridors had been quietly converted, unit by unit, into de facto hotels operating on Airbnb and VRBO. One building near Old Town Scottsdale had a listed occupancy rate of 96%. Fewer than half of those units had a permanent resident. This matters because census-style vacancy measurements count a unit as occupied if it has an active lease. If that lease belongs to an LLC running a short-term rental, the unit counts as occupied, even when it sits empty 200 nights a year. The vacancy data, in other words, is lying to you. Nashville, Raleigh, Charlotte, Jacksonville, Tampa. These cities share a profile. Rapid population growth through 2022, massive construction response, then a sharp deceleration in in-migration as remote work policies tightened and cost of living sticker shock set in. The people who were supposed to fill these apartments never fully arrived. Or they arrived, looked at the rents, and drove 45 minutes to the suburbs. What remained were buildings at 80, 85, sometimes 78% occupancy. Technically functional, practically eerie. Developers will not admit the miscalculation. They will say, lease up is ongoing. In the background, concessions are quietly offered. 1 month free, waived parking fees, gift cards. None of it appears in the official asking rent. The headline number holds steady. The building stays dark. In older, colder metros, Chicago, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Detroit, the dynamic is different, but the outcome is similar. Here, the problem is not overbuilding, it is selective abandonment. New luxury inventory is added downtown and in gentrifying neighborhoods, while older affordable housing stock deteriorates or is demolished without replacement. Chicago lost over 10,000 units of affordable housing between 2015 and 2023, primarily through neglect, demolition, and conversion. New construction replaced almost none of it at the lower price points. The result is a city with a visible construction boom on one side of the ledger and a hidden housing crisis on the other, one that does not appear in aggregate vacancy statistics because the people who lost those units are simply not counted among the displaced. They are invisible, which means the problem they represent is also invisible. Here is a number that should stop you cold. According to research cited by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, in no U.S. state can a full-time minimum wage worker afford a 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. In not one state, not Mississippi, not West Virginia, not anywhere. And yet, America built 1.7 million new apartment units. The question is not whether there is enough housing. The question is whether the housing being built is designed to be occupied or designed to be an asset. Those are two very different things. The U.S. Census Bureau's Housing Vacancy Survey is the primary instrument by which economists and policymakers measure the health of the housing market. It is a blunt tool. It counts units. It counts leases. It does not count the following: units held off-market by institutional investors awaiting appreciation, units leased to corporate housing intermediaries that are rarely occupied, units in new buildings in lease-up phase that developers do not report as vacant short-term rental units with no permanent residence, units held empty as tax loss vehicles by foreign LLCs. Adjust for those categories, and several academic economists have tried, and the true effective vacancy rate in major metro areas may be 2 to 4 percentage points higher than official figures suggest. In a housing market, 2 to 4 percentage points is the difference between equilibrium and crisis. In 2010, institutional investors, defined as entities owning 1,000 or more single-family homes or large multifamily portfolios, owned a negligible share of the U.S. rental market. By 2023, that share had grown to approximately 3 to 4% of single-family rentals and a substantially higher fraction of large multifamily buildings in Sunbelt cities. The significance is not just scale, it is incentive structure. A family that owns a small apartment building needs tenants. An institutional portfolio with a 12% vacancy across 40,000 units can, in certain interest rate environments, find that holding vacant units, avoiding costly maintenance, preserving optionality for sale or conversion, is more financially rational than filling them at market rate. This is not a conspiracy, it is a spreadsheet. And spreadsheets do not care about the dark windows. What is coming? The apartment pipeline is not empty. Projects permitted during the 2021 to 2022 construction surge are still delivering units through 2025 and into 2026. The National Multifamily Housing Council projects an additional 400,000 plus units will come online in that window. At the same time, mortgage rates remain elevated, suppressing for-sale home purchases and theoretically keeping renters in the rental market longer. But wage growth has decelerated. Household formation, the rate at which young adults establish independent households, slowed measurably as affordability constraints deepened. The roommate phenomenon, once a feature of early career life, has extended into the mid-30s for a growing share of Americans. The picture that emerges, more supply arriving into a market where effective demand backed by actual purchasing power, is eroding. Not disappearing. Eroding. The buildings will be built. The leasing offices will open. The champagne will be poured. And some floors will be dark. There is one group watching this dynamic with particular attention, Americans approaching or entering retirement, many of whom own homes in high-cost metros and are actively evaluating relocation. For them, the new apartment glut in Sunbelt cities represents a surface-level opportunity, Lower asking rents, newer stock, warm climate. But the fine print matters. Buildings with high institutional ownership and algorithmic rent management are not stable housing. Rents that fell in 2023 and early 2024 can, and in some markets already have, reversed course. A retiree on a fixed income who relocates into a deal in a building owned by a private equity-backed property manager is renting from an entity whose primary obligation is to its investors, not its tenants. Lease renewals in those buildings have, in documented cases, come with increases of 15 to 25% in a single cycle. For someone on Social Security and a modest pension, that is not an inconvenience. That is a crisis. There is a version of this story that ends with a policy recommendation, with calls for zoning reform, rent stabilization, or antitrust enforcement. Those conversations are happening in courtrooms, in congressional offices, in academic journals. This is not that story. This story is about what you can see with your own eyes. A country that built, by its own count, enough apartments to house millions of people, in a moment when millions of people cannot find stable, affordable housing. The units exist. The people exist. The math does not add up. The dark windows are the gap in the math. They are not a glitch. They are not temporary. They are the physical expression of a housing market that was restructured over the course of roughly 15 years around the logic of investment returns rather than the logic of shelter. That restructuring happened incrementally, in local zoning board meetings, in private equity term sheets, in software licensing agreements between property managers who are technically competitors. No single decision made the windows go dark. 1,000 small decisions did. And if you are renting in America right now, or planning to, or watching your children try to, you are navigating a market shaped by those decisions. A market in which the building is full on paper and empty at night. That is not a housing market. That is an asset portfolio, and you are living in it.